It's September 1st, 1939, the day World War II begins. Now imagine this date was today, and you were among the people forced into a World War II bunker for safety. The ground shakes, the air turns cold, and the steel doors slam shut. But here's the terrifying question. Would that bunker actually save you or trap you? In this video, we're going to uncover why hiding in a World War II bunker was basically a death sentence, and the shocking truths no one talks about. The first step inside the bunker always felt like stepping out of danger, as if a few meters of poured concrete could silence the physics of a world at war. People clung to that illusion because they needed to believe in something immovable, something thicker and stronger than their own fear. The walls looked permanent, dense enough to muffle the sky-shaking percussion of artillery. Yet the safety they promised was only surface deep. Every vibration that rolled through the structure exposed a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Concrete doesn't absorb force, it transmits it. A bunker wasn't a sanctuary. It was a pressure chamber waiting for the right frequency to turn its geometry lethal. Civilians stepped inside, thinking they were entering a fortress. Soldiers relied on them because doctrine told them to. But both groups were placing their survival in architecture designed for the last war, not the one now evolving above their heads. The weapons raining down had changed faster than the defenses protecting against them, creating a silent mismatch between expectation and reality. People trusted weight and thickness, never realizing that the real threat wasn't the shell that struck the surface. It was the invisible energy that rippled through the confined space afterward. The bunker myth formed in that gap between what people believed and what the physics of shock, heat, and confinement could actually deliver. And once the door shut behind them, that myth became harder to question, even as the air itself seemed to tighten with every distant impact, hinting that the structure was about to reveal its true nature. The moment a blast wave hit the exterior shell, the bunker stopped behaving like a refuge and started behaving like a sealed instrument of compression. Shock fronts don't politely dissipate when they strike concrete. They ricochet, fold, and funnel through every available cavity, accelerating as the structure struggles to contain them. Inside those narrow chambers, pressure didn't rise, it snapped upward. A violent spike that the human body was never engineered to endure. Lungs collapsed before a scream could escape. Eardrums ruptured instantly, flooding the skull with disorientation, while the rest of the body absorbed the blunt, invisible hammer of compressed air. Even if the concrete held, the people inside often teemed. The bunker turned each detonation into a physics experiment, where flesh is the variable most likely to fail. Every strike on the surface created a new internal tremor, and each tremor drew the occupants deeper into a state of silent dread, as if the structure were tightening its grip with every shock it survived, preparing to deliver its next lesson in how confinement can betray those who trust it. Reinforced concrete looked indestructible, but under sustained artillery fire, it behaved more like a rigid shell, trembling on borrowed time. Each impact sent sheer forces slicing through the walls, creating hairline cracks that multiplied with eerie precision. Rebar meant to hold everything together, twisted under the stress like metal caught in a slow, silent scream. Even when the structure didn't collapse, it began shedding pieces of itself. Thin flakes of concrete peeled off at bullet-fast velocities, turning the air inside into a storm of razor fragments. Floors shuddered as shock traveled through the foundation, transferring the violence of each strike directly into the bones of anyone trapped below. The bunker didn't need to break open to kill. It only needed to vibrate, to shiver, to let its own material betray the people clinging to it. And as the tremors accumulated, the space around them began to feel less like shelter and more like a creature waiting to shed its final layer. Air inside a bunker carried a quiet desperation, long before the fighting outside reached its peak. Oxygen slipped away in increments, too subtle for panic to notice, replaced by the slow, sour rise of carbon dioxide that thickened the atmosphere like an invisible fog. Breathing became a negotiation. The body kept losing lungs, drawing in air that no longer nourished. Each inhale lighter in oxygen, heavier in the gases exhaled by everyone trapped inside. The walls didn't need to crack to become lethal. They only needed to seal well enough to keep fresh air from finding its way back in. Ventilation shafts. The supposed lifelines betrayed their purpose the moment heat or pressure shifted outside. Instead of delivering relief, they acted as narrow funnels where fire, smoke, and metallic dust could be pulled inward with terrifying speed. A chimney effect that turned the intake of air into a delivery system for everything the outside world was trying to kill. Fumes from burning soil, unspent propellant, and ruptured munitions drifted inside long before anyone smelled them, numbing thought, slowing reaction, and pushing bodies toward unconsciousness. The bunker became a place where time compressed, where survival shrank from hours to minutes without a single explosion breaching the walls. And as the air thinned to a metallic stillness, those inside felt the first hints of a truth they weren't ready to face. A tightening in their chest that signaled how quickly their perceived sanctuary was edging towards something far more hostile. Fire didn't need to enter a bunker to claim it. It only needed a breach the width of a hand, a vent left uncovered, or a pressure shift that pulled outside air inward. Incendiary mixtures crawled through those openings as liquid flame, clinging to surfaces and inhaling oxygen faster than the people trapped inside. The moment fire took hold, the enclosure transformed into a convection chamber. Heat rose, rebounded off the low ceiling, and folded downward again, compressing the temperature in brutal waves that climbed from survivable warmth to skin-blistering extremes in the span of a breath. Metal fixtures glowed, paint vaporized, and every object capable of burning contributed to a rising cloud of toxins that flooded the lungs before the flames themselves ever touched flesh. Smoke shells delivered their own quiet cruelty. Their chemicals spread low and fast, turning the bunker's stagnant air into a dense suspension of carbon monoxide and microscopic metal particles. Breathing became an act of self-poisoning, each inhale a deeper submission to a space stripping oxygen away while replacing it with something colder, duller, and far more final. Thick walls didn't stop fire, they held it in place, trapping heat, fumes, and panic in a sealed chamber that offered no escape and no mercy. And as the temperature climbed toward the point where instinct began to fracture, the illusion of protection dissolved into a choking haze that hinted at yet another danger waiting deeper inside. The mind began to unravel long before the walls showed any sign of failing. Inside the bunker, sound behaved strangely muffled, delayed, warped by concrete until every distant impact felt both far away and uncomfortably close. That distortion carved out a space where imagination filled the gaps with threats more vivid than reality. Claustrophobia crept in as an instinctive tremor, a tightening in the chest that no amount of reasoning could loosen. Shadows deepened, breaths grew uneven, and the clarity needed to make survival decisions dissolved under a rising tide of stress hormones that flooded the bloodstream like a silent toxin. Panic didn't erupt. It seeped, sliding into thoughts one compromised assumption at a time. The longer people waited, the more their internal clocks fractured. Minutes stretched, hesitation calcified, and the strategy of enforced silence meant to keep them hidden became a trap of its own. Fear, muted voices, stalled movement, and convinced entire groups to remain underground even when escape was still possible. Every second spent in stillness allowed cortisol to sharpen dread and dull reason, replacing coordinated action with a trance-like inertia that left them listening, breathing, and deteriorating in the dark. The bunker worked on the mind as ruthlessly as it worked on the body, shaping a mental landscape where judgment faltered and survival instincts collided with the oppressive weight of the enclosure. And as thoughts tightened like the air around them, a new anxiety began to settle, in a growing awareness that isolation wasn't just affecting their senses, but aligning them with something even more dangerous lurking within the structure's silence. It began with the first distant concussion, a low thud that rolled across the earth and settled into the bunker like a warning pulse. Within seconds, the chamber vibrated with the second strike, a deeper impact that loosened a fine rain of dust from the ceiling. Vision blurred as the air turned opaque, every breath mixing with powdered concrete that clung to the throat and scratched the lungs. The third explosion hit closer. The pressure wave arrived like a silent punch, bending knees and stealing equilibrium as the vents coughed out their last threads of clean air. Minutes slipped by, each one marked by sharper tremors and a growing heat that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. The structure groaned under the escalating bombardment, microcracks branching across its surface like veins under a microscope. When incendiaries struck, they didn't need to breach the entrance. The temperature spike alone was enough to ignite anything flammable inside, turning the bunker into a sealed furnace. Smoke spiraled through the confined space, thickening until sight dissolved entirely and breathing became an act of endurance, measured in seconds. In this timeline, survival probability didn't fall gradually, collapsed. Every system designed to protect the occupants inverted under stress, transforming the bunker from a defensive asset into a compression chamber where heat, toxins, and structural shrapnel converged. What had been built as a shield now stood poised to finish what the bombardment had started, tightening its hold with each successive strike as the outside world continued. Its relentless push toward total destruction. Human error wove itself into the bunker long before the first shell ever landed. Training manuals spoke in absolutes, promising protection based on outdated assumptions and misread engineering tables that underestimated the violence modern munitions could unleash. Commanders desperate to offer their men a sense of control leaned into those assurances, repeating them until they became doctrine. Soldiers followed the habit of routine, civilians followed the authority of uniform. And together, they stepped into shelters whose weaknesses were hidden beneath layers of confidence rather than concrete. Bias played its own quiet part, convincing people that disaster struck others, not them. The fortress mentality built around these structures was less about physics and more about hope, insistence that thick walls translated to certainty, that stillness equaled safety, that remaining underground was always the rational choice. Red flags flickered in the form of poor ventilation, outdated reinforcement diagrams, and audible structural distress. Yet each warning was softened by the belief that the bunker had held before and would hold again. Trust became the final, fatal component, binding them to an infrastructure that could not support the faith placed in it. And as the last door sealed behind them, that misplaced certainty began to twist into something far harder to escape. Beneath the bunker, the ground itself was shifting in ways no one inside could sense. Soil that looked solid from the surface behaved differently under repeated shock, loosening grain by grain until it moved like liquid under the foundation. Each artillery impact churned the earth, reducing stability and allowing the structure to settle unevenly. Floors tilted by degrees too small to notice at first, but enough to introduce hairline fractures and strain the already overworked reinforcement. Groundwater followed, seeping through microscopic channels opened by the vibrations. Cold moisture pooled across the floor, carrying minerals, oils, and bacterial colonies stirred from the deeper layers of disturbed earth. Inside that stagnant humidity, the bunker transformed into a micro-ecosystem with its own hostile rules. Water mixed with pulverized concrete to form an alkaline slurry that burned skin and irritated lungs. Bacteria thrived in the warmth and darkness, feeding on organic debris and releasing a sour odor that signaled the early stages of contamination. These silent intrusions grew more dangerous as the bombardment intensified. Structural shifts opened new pathways for flooding, and the pressure of soaked soil pressed inward with a force. The walls were never designed to resist. People feared the shells outside, yet the deadliest threats were the ones unfolding beneath their feet and behind the walls slow. Unseen variables that turned their shelter into an environment collapsing from within. And as the water rose and the ground subtly buckled, a deeper unease began to spread through the ranks of those trapped inside. A realization that the danger surrounding them was no longer just external. Survival inside a World War II bunker hinged on variables that were mathematically stacked against anyone who stepped inside. Airflow alone created a losing equation. The volume of breathable oxygen was finite, the rate of co-accumulation predictably steep, and the narrow vents incapable of exchanging air fast enough to offset even a small group's metabolic demands. Structural geometry added its own constraints. The rigid angles and low ceilings amplified shock waves, channeling force into concentrated pockets where pressure spiked beyond what human organs could tolerate. Every blast reshaped the internal atmosphere, compressing air and accelerating debris in patterns that no amount of reinforcement could fully counter. Biology offered no refuge. The human body could withstand only brief exposure to sudden pressure changes, limited oxygen, and rapid temperature shifts. The bunker delivered all three in overlapping cycles. Physics did not negotiate, and the numbers never balanced in the occupants' favor. On paper, in field tests, and in collapse reports, the conclusion was identical. The protective value of the structure was eclipsed by the cumulative threats it intensified. Safety inside these enclosures was a theoretical construct, not a practical reality, and the only reliable strategy for survival existed outside the very walls people trusted most. Survival was never guaranteed by the thickness of a wall or the depth of a hiding place. It was defined by perception, by understanding what the threat actually was, rather than what fear or tradition said it might be. The bunker symbolized a collective misunderstanding, a belief that danger was always external and that fortification alone could halt its advance. Yet every layer of concrete only amplified the truth. Protection without comprehension is an illusion. The people who stepped inside weren't just seeking shelter. They were surrendering to a false geometry of safety, trusting mass and silence over physics and biology. The final betrayal wasn't structural. It was conceptual. The bunker stood as a monument to human instinct, overpowering human insight, a reminder that fear drives us downward, inward, toward enclosed spaces where danger feels distant even as it surrounds us completely. What collapsed inside those chambers wasn't only air quality or structural integrity, it was the assumption that hiding is the same as surviving. And as the last echo of bombardment faded from the walls, the lesson became unmistakable. Clarity, not concrete, is the first barrier between life and oblivion.